Hey guys, welcome back to another rapid update. In this video, we're going to talk about buybacks, dividends, and executive compensation in the pharmaceutical industry and how it potentially impacts drug pricing. Stick around. So the US House of Representatives published a few days ago their 7th staff report in a series of reports focused on drug pricing. The theme of this specific report was on buybacks, dividends, and executive compensation in the pharmaceutical industry. And the purpose of this video is to reflect on some of the contents and summarize it and provide some commentary. So the initial process to investigate pharmaceutical pricing and business practices by the House Committee on Oversight and Reform started whilst Donald Trump was president in January 14th, 2019. That's almost a full 2 years before Joe Biden became president in the US. And that work has still continued to date, suggestive that there is a bipartisan agreement in the policy priority of pharmaceutical pricing in the US, and it could potentially impact other countries too. And they summarize here at the opening paragraphs that the pharmaceutical industry has been targeted for price increases for many years while cutting prices in the rest of the world. Current law prohibits Medicare negotiation directly between the pharmaceutical industry and Medicare, and this is a potential inefficiency within the drug pricing system that this report is reflecting on. And then it moves on to highlighting the specific components and the subject of the report, which is stock buybacks, dividends to investors, executive compensation, and research and development. What this is suggestive of is that the report is attempting or aiming to present the reader with a question on prioritization. Is when you're balancing the expenditure on buybacks, dividends, and executive compensation, and you're comparing it to the level of research and development, does one need to reprioritize how these resources are allocated internally within the pharmaceutical industry, and how do they potentially then impact drug pricing? What the authors of this report do is they create those direct linkages between these three components and research and development on a couple of sections, and we'll highlight those. And then a few of the concluding remarks that have been summarized here from the period of 2016 to 2020. 14 leading global pharmaceutical companies were analyzed. They spent $577 billion on stock buybacks and dividends. And this is 56 billion more than is spent on research and development over the same period of time. And I'll show a couple of graphics a little further down in the report that illustrates this point during that time period. Other notable conclusions were that amongst the 14 global companies, 8 of them were US companies that spent even less on research and development compared to buybacks and dividends. And then over the same period of time, 14 companies at top executives total $3.2 billion, with an annual compensation growing by 14% over that 5-year period. And finally, that research and development budget on finding ways to suppress generic and biosimilar competition, which is no surprise, but it has been noted in this report. So let's jump onto some of the figures. But before we go on, here is a list of companies that they had a look at: AbbVie, Amgen, AstraZeneca, Bristol Myers Squibb, Eli Lilly, Gilead, GSK, J&J, Merck, Novartis, Novo Nordisk, Pfizer, Roche, and Sanofi. So these are global firms, and the researchers extracted annual reports and annual financial statements and analyzed all the information included in there and summarized it and presented in this report. They also did these currency conversions in cases where companies such as Roche were headquartered outside of the United States, Novo Nordisk as well, and required then a currency conversion from euros into US dollars. So the first interesting table is the following: buybacks total from 2016 to 2020, 219,000. Dividends 358, total buybacks 577,000, compared to research and development over the same period of 521,000. So of course it's more. The only two companies that buck this trend, that spend more on research and development, was AstraZeneca and Roche, that spent more on research and development than on buybacks and dividends every year from 2016 to 2020. To explain a little bit further about what a buyback is, it's when the company purchases available stock in the company with available cash on hand after deducting all your expenses and your taxes, basically cash on hand. That is then used to purchase available stock. What that does, it drives the demand for that stock. It drives the price of that the stock further up as well over a period of time. What is linked to this, and what is often not seen as part of a buyback strategy, is a lot of the senior executives in the pharmaceutical industry, not just the pharmaceutical industry, I should add, it also applies to financial services, construction, insurance market across the board, is those senior executives have stock options in the company. So by using company resources in buybacks, that drives up the demand of the stock, whilst at the same time driving up the value of the stock options that the senior executives have, then of course it increases their compensation. So there's a degree of perverse incentive embedded within this use of corporate resources to drive up the demand for stocks, stock price in particular, especially if they are listed companies. This I see as problematic. I don't see dividends as a problematic feature, mostly because these dividends are distributed across all investors, and they range from the super large to the very small. So anyone that has bought stock in Pfizer or some of these large pharmaceutical companies is benefiting that, from small families to very large corporations, and providing dividends to individuals and institutions that put capital at risk to support the research and development or the operational activities of different companies is not in itself problematic. It's a key feature of corporate structures, and I would add that it is a core feature of capitalism, in the sense that you are exposing your available capital to potential risk in return for a potential reward. So that's on the dividend side. And the research and development, there's clearly a lot more transparency needed and reprioritization required in the R&D space. But let's continue then on to other graphics that would also highlight issues in executive compensation. Here is, over the same time period, up to 2020, a list of all of the 14 companies listed from highest through to lowest. So executives in J&J earn the most at 375 million over that period, total cumulative. The least well paid in this group is 63 million over that period of time. 5 years, but the escalation has grown quite a bit. And as remarked a little bit earlier in the report, that percentage is 14. I'm less concerned about the absolute figure in rewarding executives for the work that they do. And in fact, you will always have in society the disproportionate distribution, or rather the rewarding individuals within society that carry greater responsibility for managing public assets or corporate assets, rewarding them with adequate compensation. So the absolute amount, in my view, is not a concern, but the annual increase of 14% that far exceeds consumer price inflation, for instance, in many of these markets is concerning. So I think some work in the future may be required to ensure that on a proportionate basis, that the percentage increase proportionately for the executives matches up to the rest of the market. Another graphic that may also benefit, may interest you and benefit the conversation, is the following, linking specifically executive compensation to drug prices. So the committee's investigation found that price increases on certain brand name drugs led directly to higher bonuses for executives. They cite the example of Celgene here, particularly Revlimid, and in particular the company tied, and this is a case of AbbVie, the company tied bonus directly to Humira net revenue targets, which increased year after year. This again may potentially be problematic in the sense that it's not really focusing on what the key issue here is. The key issue is so they incentivizing pricing, but the key issue here is the volume, and volume here is related to epidemiology and it's related to unmet need. Executives should ideally be incentivized to focus on reaching patients that are currently undiagnosed or that have not been able to access a newer drug, and thus increasing the volume multiplied by the price of the drug that's available, rather than disproportionately increasing the price amongst a smaller patient base or a smaller patient population. I think this executive compensation issue would need to, of necessity, focus on this volume component over here, rather than pushing up price too much. Those are my views, but I'll be very interested to hear what your opinions are in the comments below. And the U.S. House of Representatives, the staffers, got their hands on some internal documents from AbbVie in this case, which they are citing quite frequently, internal presentation, internal documents. And there's a very good example a little further down, where in talking about high prices, internal documents were sourced from Celgene, and they found very specifically this slide deck, presumably, and this slide, which is slide number 3, in which the author of this PowerPoint presentation stated that drug pricing in the US, highly favorable environment with free market pricing, which is known, generally favorable, pointing at Canada, and Europe, manageable, and then in Japan. These are your major markets. So this is an example of how the author of this PowerPoint presentation, he or she would never have guessed that the slide 3 would have appeared in a U.S. House of Representatives staff report. And the final concluding remarks on this report notes the following: the world's largest drug companies spend more on buybacks, dividends, and executive compensation. The issue here, as I've already mentioned, is not necessarily that the executive compensation is high, but rather that it is potentially disproportionate as well. So this is a good policy piece to have a conversation. Anyway, so those are my views. What do you think? Do you think buybacks, dividends, executive compensation is too high vis-a-vis the research and development expenditure in the pharmaceutical industry? What do you think? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks so much. Take care. Bye.